Welcome to my session, Murky Waters, Navigating Projects with Multiple Stakeholders or Vendors. My name is Kelly Bassing. I'm a Customer Success Manager at MediaCurrent. I've been with MediaCurrent for coming up on 2 years as part of our Client Services Department. My primary focus is on customer satisfaction and client retention. I manage a number of projects and support retainers from across a wide range of industries, including nonprofit, higher ed, government, and the private sector. If you haven't heard of MediaCurrent before, indulge me for a moment while I evangelize for us. MediaCurrent is a team of over 75 highly talented individuals running the gamut from back and front-end development to UX design, DevOps, strategy, and client services and project management. We've been specializing in Drupal for 10 years, and we work as a full-service provider for clients who are eager to build and maintain Drupal websites that provide high ROI and exceed client expectations. So today we're going to be talking about how to successfully manage projects which involve multiple stakeholders, third-party vendors, and/or client-side developers. I'm sure we're all aware that every additional contact you add to a conversation can complicate an engagement exponentially. So we'll cover some of the most common pitfalls, recommendations for building and maintaining healthy relationships with our clients, and even touch on some real-world examples briefly at the end. So before we dive into what I'm calling the keys to success, let's talk about the different types of individuals who might be involved in these complex projects. First and most important role to establish a relationship with is our client stakeholder, or in this case, stakeholders plural. So what do I mean by the word stakeholder? This is an individual or individuals to whom we answer throughout our relationship with the client. Stakeholders will usually have a lot of pull in their organization and may control the budget and decision-making around future vendor relationships. So clearly it's very important that we have a good relationship with them. Stakeholders are the most important individuals to please, especially because the success of any engagement with that client is largely determined by their own perspective and firsthand experience with us. Despite this fact, some stakeholders might not be involved in daily communications, so we do have to work extra hard to build and maintain that relationship. Examples of stakeholders may include an IT or marketing manager, VP, or other executive. And the other roles we're talking about today are third-party vendors and client-side developers. A third-party vendor is an individual or team who is not an employee of our client. The client is paying them for deliverables or services rendered just as they're paying us for our services. These third-party vendors may be another development team, a marketing or design agency, or a hosting provider, and they may have a longer and more established relationship with our client. We have to treat third-party vendors as the incumbent and work well together if we truly want a healthy client relationship. Client-side developers, on the other hand, are employed by the client. They may have Drupal experience, but they're likely not an expert, and that's why the client has come to us. Client-side developers may be involved in daily communications, code reviews, QA, or deployment, and they must be treated as members of our own team. Now that we've defined the roles, let's move on to some of the keys to success. First and foremost, it's our responsibility to build a relationship with everyone involved in the project. Again, this includes our client stakeholders, third-party vendors, and client-side developers. But we also need to establish relationships with any additional client points of contact. It's not uncommon for clients to have their own project manager or product owner, internal marketing teams, design resources, or content editors. Even though we may not see these individuals every week or even every month, we still need to focus on their satisfaction and ensure that they feel they're being heard and valued. We also need to be the ones driving the conversation with our clients. Hopefully everyone here feels pretty comfortable serving as a consultative partner. We don't want to be order takers. So if a client asks for a laundry list of requests and 40 out of the 50 items they asked for either won't help them achieve their goals or will actually hinder them, we have to be ready to speak up and not be a yes man. If you're not as confident in that space, involve a strategist who can make better recommendations based on client goals and research to support those recommendations. Another area that's vital to leading a successful project is breaking down the silos and keeping the lines of communication open. When clients come to us with multiple stakeholders, they're more often than not from different departments and may have very different ideas of what they think is best for the business. It may feel natural for them to stay in their bubbles and only communicate with us and not with each other, but that's a recipe for tears. We need to encourage the various stakeholders to talk to each other and work together, even when we're not there to lead the conversations. If we let them stay separate, each stakeholder is just shouting into an echo chamber. They may hold resentment against the others, and it all goes downhill from there. The better answer is to treat stakeholders equally and as a cohesive unit, making a Venn diagram of where their goals intersect so you can help them communicate. Never prioritizing one stakeholder over another unless you have explicitly been told that one has more say. Instead, strive to have all stakeholders join every call and copy them on every email. If a stakeholder emails you privately and it's not specifically information that only that stakeholder is privy to, copy in the other stakeholders on your reply so everyone's on the same page. And finally, a big recommendation for maintaining stakeholder relationships is to coordinate regular client health check-ins without the development team or other contacts. This provides an open forum to talk about anything going well or going poorly and reinforces that you care about their long-term success. At MediaCurrent, the client services team conducts quarterly check-ins with our clients, frequently with clients who are not our own. That particular aspect can be helpful for clients who don't feel comfortable broaching bad news with someone they talk to daily, or clients who feel their concerns aren't being heard or addressed by their main point of contact. Let's dig in a little deeper and talk about what we need for a successful project start and ongoing management. One of the first things we need to do when starting a project is to define what the KPIs and goals we're working toward are. KPI is kind of a buzzword and tossed around a lot, but I've found in my experience that a lot of people in our industry are confused by the term, or they're not sure how it's different from a goal. So a KPI, or a key performance indicator, is a measurement of success toward achieving a goal. Some examples of KPIs are number of user sessions on a site, Google search rankings, and conversion rates. By contrast, a goal is what specifically the client hopes to achieve, driven by set KPIs. A goal may be increasing monthly traffic by 20%, ranking in the top 3 results for a set keyword, or earning 10 conversions per day on a particular web form. When creating goals, we like to use the SMART criteria. If you've seen this before, it's probably pretty familiar. While the acronym has been expanded greatly to include a variety of terms seen here, the overarching theme is that a goal must be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. If your client is handing you goals which fail to meet any of these criteria, it's time to help them revisit their goals. Otherwise, you're not going to have a successful project. In addition to setting and agreeing upon the KPIs and goals, we absolutely have to know who the key players are. A project without clearly identified stakeholders and points of contact is a non-starter and will flounder and fail quickly. The first question to ask is, who are the stakeholders and how many are there? One of the exercises we do is create a visual representation or account mapping to illustrate the hierarchy and relationships of our client stakeholders and contacts. You can see to the right here an example of this. We have 5 individuals identified with 2 VPs above the other 3. This is actually an active account map for one of my clients. We've just changed the names to protect the innocent. We can also identify the difference between active and silent stakeholders. Active stakeholders are present on regular calls and emails and are actively engaged in the project. Silent stakeholders, by contrast, may be higher-level executives who appoint other stakeholders to speak for them. It's important to note that silent stakeholders should still be included on communications unless they have expressly stated they're only to be contacted in certain circumstances. Once the stakeholders are identified, we need to know who our primary point of contact is. One of the stakeholders or another individual likely appointed by a silent stakeholder. This might be a product owner or a project manager on the client side. And lastly, we need to know who should have access to various systems like Jira and Confluence, or the repository management like Bitbucket or GitHub. As soon as a new project kicks off, we need to know what we're working with. Version control and repository management may seem like a no-brainer, but don't make that assumption. We actually had a client last year who came in with a Drupal 6 site and absolutely no version control. They were one hack away from losing their entire site. So of course the first thing we did when they came in was set up a Git repo for them. So first thing first, verify if Git is being used and on what system, and set it up if it's not. Find out who the hosting provider is and get access. Without that knowledge, you're dead in the water for deployments. Cover the pull request review and approval process, especially when dealing with third-party or client-side devs who may not be aware of this process or following best practices. Cover server setup and configuration. Do they have dev, stage, and prod all configured the same? Only dev and prod? Only prod? I really hope not. If they have dev, stage, and prod, are they all using the same PHP version? Are they all using the same database version? And finally, but most importantly, review and enforce best practices. Not every developer or agency knows Git flow or is using it. Some might be skipping code reviews or reviewing their own code. And never, ever skip QA. There's a funny meme with the most interesting man in the world that says, "I don't always test my code, but when I do, I test it in production." Don't let that be you or your team. Make sure other devs are following these steps. A crucial item, but one that's often skipped, is making sure to level set on the client approval process. Without this in place, there will almost certainly be questions down the road about who needs to be approving tickets and marking them complete. A stakeholder or appointed individual should be responsible for approving tickets and the project as a whole. If there is one stakeholder to rule them all, make that clear and communicate it to everyone early so you can reference back to it if conflicts arise. Make sure the individual knows how and where to approve work, and fall back on your hierarchy relationship account map if needed to resolve disagreements. A lot of what we've talked about so far is dealt with when a project originates, but I want to take some time to more directly address maintaining successful client relationships throughout a project or during a support engagement. Keep including every stakeholder in all invitations to meetings and copy them on every email you send unless you are specifically requested not to by that individual. Focus on retaining client relationships with all individuals from every side. This doesn't just cover stakeholders and client contacts, but client-side developers and even third-party vendors. You never know when you need to cash in some of that goodwill. And don't forget to include your lead developer and strategist in client communications. They need to foster relationships with the client too, so help the client feel like they're more of a partner and less of someone who's just paying you. It also prevents you from being a single point of failure. It's especially problematic if you're ever out sick, on vacation, or you're pulled off the project suddenly or leave the company. If you're running agile sprints, strive to include at least one priority from each stakeholder in every sprint so they know they're being heard and their input is valued. When in doubt, think of the 3 T's. Focus on transparency, trust, and teamwork. Don't ever lie to your clients. The second you tell a lie, that trust is broken, and it is very hard, if not impossible, to earn back. Clients and vendors should always feel that we're all in this together. Now let's touch on some specific issues you may face, like stakeholders with differing or competing priorities. This is probably the biggest pitfall I see when stakeholders come from different departments, so we have to be prepared to address it. If you have a strategy team, they can be your first line of defense in these situations. Strategists will know better than most what really should be a priority and what will have the greatest impact on ROI, as well as where you can satisfy both sides. Help your stakeholders compromise. Look back on that Venn diagram you may have made of intersecting goals and focus on sprint plans that include priorities from each. Maybe one sprint's heavier on work for stakeholder A, but the next is heavy on work for stakeholder B. And if you've created an MVP or a minimum viable product, leverage that to resolve priority conflicts. But remember that scope can and should be flexible if you're running an agile project. When working with clients who have their own internal dev teams and third-party vendors, it is very easy to run into the too many cooks in the kitchen syndrome. If 15 people join an hour-long call, you'll run into people talking over each other, some resenting those who are more outspoken, and a big mess at the end of the day. Limit your sprint planning meetings to primary stakeholders to avoid this. This is also where your upfront legwork will come in handy. Stick to your defined approvals process so people aren't jumping over each other while commenting on tickets. You may also find that you want to restrict access to certain systems. Some clients will ask that everyone on their team be included on things like Jira and Confluence and Bitbucket, but that can just make for more of a mess at the end of the day. Not every single person who works for a client needs to know what's happening when we're spinning up a development environment. They don't need to know every single bug that was caught in QA. And sometimes that can just turn into more noise and you won't get the project done on time. It's also important to establish a clear delineation of tickets, and we'll talk about this more in a moment when we cover task ownership between the different parties. So standardizing on workflow and best practices. We talked about this briefly already, but you do want to set expectations early. Provide documentation on Git flow and best practices, especially if you're working with third-party vendors or client-side developers who may or may not know what Git flow is and how to use it. One of our developers actually created a fantastic document a couple of years ago for a client who has external developers who were not using Git flow at all. They were doing things like using SFTP to put changes on the server. So we drafted a very extensive document with diagrams and everything to illustrate Git flow. And we drove that home. We trained them. We tried to enforce it. When it failed, we retrained them. I've probably done that 5 times by now. But sometimes that's what you need to do. So be prepared to train, enforce, and retrain if needed. When it comes to multiple vendors and task ownership, you have to do the same as you did for stakeholders. Don't silo your vendors and client-side developers. You need to treat them all as one team and treat them as if they're on your team. But set boundaries around who's responsible for what. When you have tickets set up in Jira or another project management system, make sure you're assigning those to specific individuals. You can set up labels and components to identify if a particular vendor is responsible for a set of tickets or group them by epic. That's where leveraging a project management system comes in. And always stick to the identified approval process. And lastly, lead by example. This comes in with best practices, but also with task ownership. You need to make sure that you're following best practices on tickets as well, and that you're not letting tickets just sit there and flounder for weeks. So let's talk about some real-world examples. A few clients who I directly work with who have some of these situations are 3 you see on the screen here: Habitat for Humanity, Mercy College, and the New York State Senate. Habitat for Humanity has really the trifecta going on, but right now just 2 primarily. They have multiple stakeholders and client-side developers. When we were building their Drupal 8 site last year, there was also a third-party vendor who had done design. With the multiple stakeholders, we're dealing with the director of IT and the director of web services. So we had to be satisfying both the technical side and the communications and marketing side. We needed to make sure that we were talking to both of them, talking to them equally, and helping them speak with each other. Our status calls, we would include up to 10 or 15 people from Habitat. That's not a sprint planning call, but that's an actual status call, so everyone could hear what the progress was. They could see demos as we were going through the project. Habitat also has client-side developers. So those client-side developers were working on tickets concurrently with us. They were working on the Drupal 7 site while we were building the Drupal 8 site. And we also needed to help train them on Drupal 8 because the developers on their team had not worked with Drupal 8 before. In addition to coming on our regular status calls, we also have a weekly dev consultation call that we set up just with our developers and their developers, where everyone can get together and talk about any issues they're having. We can reinforce best practices and go through more training if needed. New York State Senate is another that has client-side developers, and we actually work with their developers pretty exclusively on our weekly status calls. We have one primary stakeholder, but he doesn't usually join the status calls. Instead, he relies on two of the higher developers to handle those communications. But we're on a weekly status call with up to 5 or 6 of their developers. We're working on tickets concurrently with them, and we have to manage deployments where we have different commits coming in from their team and commits coming in from our team. It's critical that we have a solid relationship with them, because if we have to send back code that didn't pass review, they can't get angry. If we have a good relationship with them, then it's much easier to say, I'm sorry, that didn't pass code review, I need you to fix it. They also have a third-party vendor for hosting, which is Pantheon. You might not think of that really as a third-party vendor, but it is. So sometimes we will join a call with Pantheon. There's a quarterly customer check-in with Pantheon in the New York State Senate. And we actually were recently on one of those calls so we could hear some of the issues that might have been happening and help them prioritize future work. And lastly, Mercy College is one that has both multiple stakeholders and third-party vendors. So the multiple stakeholders are from the IT department and marketing. Now, these stakeholders probably work better together than any other client I've seen. They actually talk to each other. They agree on what the priorities are. And that's been a really nice change from a lot of other clients. But we still have to make sure that we're maintaining relationships with both of them and helping them talk to each other. Sometimes we'll get on a status call and one of them will disagree with something being a priority. If something gets approved by the IT department, it still has to pass marketing's seal of approval before it goes out to the website, because anything that might change the content or the theme of the website has to be approved by marketing first. And they also have third-party vendors who work on both their hosting and development. We have to have a solid relationship with that vendor because they're the ones who are managing the deployments and managing Acquia. If we don't have a good relationship with them, they can ignore all of our commits. They can not tell us anything that they're doing, and then we'll have a plethora of merge conflicts at the end of the day, and something might break when it goes out to production. So making sure that we have those solid relationships is vital. And lastly, I'd just like to do a quick recap and some takeaways. So the key takeaways here: build relationships with everyone, keep the lines of communication open, define the KPIs and goals, the MVP and key players, lead by example with best practices, follow the 3 T's: transparency, trust, and teamwork. And remember, we're all in this together. And if you can manage that, then hopefully that crocodile in the murky water won't get you. And thank you. I would like to open it up to questions now, and sort of an open forum style even. So if anyone asks a question and someone feels you would well answer that question, then feel free.
Any leadership around when the topic of monetary disagreement comes around? I mean, that's a broad subject, I know, but...
That can be a fun one. Yeah, occasionally, and we've seen this with Mercy actually, where sometimes the marketing department will fund something separately from the IT department, if it's something that they really want, but isn't perhaps a bug that IT is really concerned with. So the marketing department wanted a new landing page to drive potential students to the website. So we talked to them, we talked to all of them together, and then we made up a proposal just for the marketing department so that they could approve their separate budget. So that way it wasn't coming out of IT's budget, it was actually the marketing team.
In your examples, overall, how many people are you working with the 3 examples?
With Habitat for Humanity, we have about 8 people on our weekly status calls right now, and 2 client-side developers who we talk to on a weekly basis. But there are a few other individuals who might chime in occasionally or join a call here and there.
How many on media current side?
On the media current side, we have a lead developer, 2 additional back-end developers, and 1 lead front-end developer, in addition to, obviously, myself. And then we have QA resources who come in to check on the tickets before they get sent over. New York State Senate, we've got, as I said, 5 or 6 developers on their side who we talk to on a regular basis. And then we have 3 developers who are regularly working on tickets on our side on a weekly basis. Shrop and Bio back there actually are 2 of the guys who work on that a fair amount. And then Mercy College, the third-party vendor, we usually have about 4 individuals that we talk to in our weekly status calls. Another 3 or 4 who are on the client side but not developers. And then there are 2 developers on our side right now. Any other questions?
Do you have a sales team that's dedicated to just the sales process and then they hand it over to you, or is it a sale ever instigated from like the individuals in the conference?
We have a sales team, and then when projects sign, they get sent over to either the client services team or to the project management team. Clients who are managed by a client services team member, like myself, if I have a client like Habitat or Mercy or New York State Senate, if there is a new opportunity, then that's actually something that gets run through me, and it doesn't touch sales unless I need their assistance with something or a proposal review. So established clients are usually handled by the client services team.
Gotcha.
Do you have a particular app or service you use for keeping track of the project as it goes along? Maybe there was a gap where you had to wait for information, that kind of thing.
We use Jira, the Atlassian product. So Jira for our ticket management, and then Confluence for documentation, meeting notes, things like that. And then also Bitbucket, since it all connects together, for our repository management. And then internally, we also use Slack for our communications.
I think it's also helpful the way, like, whenever she's like putting together like a agenda for the weekly meeting, like I think that type of thing gets launched every week. So it's not just like an email sitting out there. We just that way you're like, oh, what did we talk about last week? And make sure things don't fall off. I would be terrible about that.
How do you typically handle your client calls? Like, is it all phone calls, or do you bring in presentations, or?
It depends on the week and the project. So Habitat, when we were running the Drupal 8 build, we would do weekly or bi-weekly demos depending on what we had to show. But some of the other projects where it's mostly support or strategy and there's not really anything to showcase, we'll be on a Zoom call, so a conference call, and there's an opportunity to screen share if there's anything to share there. Shrop just shared his screen showing some BHAT tests he had set up for New York State Senate last week, so that was pretty cool. It's nice and flexible. I prefer having a conference system where I can set up a screen share at a moment's notice if need be, rather than just sticking with phone calls. But sometimes the client will just call me on my cell phone out of the blue. Right. Well, thank you all.